Hi, welcome back to Video at the Ville. This is Professor Greenwald. This is Government 112. This is state and local government. Today we'd like to talk about state legislatures. Let's start out in our discussion of state legislatures by looking at what do? What is the function of a state legislature? Well, it seems that their function is fourfold. Number one, of course, they have to make our laws. They have to come up with solutions to societal problems, right? Lawmaking. Secondly, they express public opinion when voters around their individual districts have strong feelings about some issue or another. Those voters expect their House member or their state senator to express those viewpoints within the debates of that particular house, that particular chamber. Number three, they are expected to serve constituents. When the voters have problems of one sort or another with state government or just need some red tape cut, they look to their state representatives and their state senators to be able to help them. Fourthly and finally, the state legislature exists to oversee the executive branch, to try to keep corruption out of the executive branch and to make sure the executive branch and the executive bureaucracy of the state is running the way that the legislature had mandated it. Well, those are the goals, those are the functions of the legislature. What are the goals of an individual legislator? Well, first and foremost is re-election. Unless they are elected and re-elected, they can't do anything else. So just as we find is true in the case of the Congress at the national level, we find at the state level that state representatives in the House of Representatives and state senators in the state Senate, their number one goal is re-election as well, so that they can do these other things. Number two, this is the answer that we frequently expect to hear first, is the creation of good public policy. All of the folks serving in the state legislature are hopefully there to solve public problems. So the creation of good public policy. Number three, any human in any type of organization will eventually hope to be perceived as special in some way in that institution or that organization. And so it's true that in a state senate or a state house that individual members seek to be recognized and eventually to have influence, be recognized as something special. Well, the most influential spots in the state legislature are to be the chairs of either the Appropriations Committee or one of the Revenue and Finance Committees, which would set the taxes for state government and establish the ways in which state government is going to earn the money that is necessary to fund those appropriations. Fourthly and finally, after re-election and the creation of good public policy and to obtain influence within the chamber, in addition to obtaining influence within the chamber, we find that state representatives and state senators also seek to, number four, enrich their districts, bring home the bacon. They want to enrich their districts and sometimes enrich themselves and their families. Perhaps the best example of this would be Senator Robert Byrd, who just passed away a little while ago. Senator Byrd, of course, had a long legislative career from the state of West Virginia. We find that he had risen to the point where he was Senate Majority Leader. He has the number one position in the U.S. Senate, and he gave it up. And why did he give it up? He gave it up, as he told his friends later, because he was advancing in age, and he said he didn't know how many more years he had to live. He wanted to be sure to bring home the bacon to the voters of West Virginia, to make sure that the people of West Virginia benefited from his time, from his service in the U.S. Senate. So he resigned the majority leader's position and he took up the position of the head of the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And he also had the the job, the ceremonial job of being President Pro Tem of the U.S. Senate. In that capacity, he had a limousine pick him up for work and take him home. He had a very nice office in the Capitol, and he presided over the U.S. Senate when the Vice President wasn't there. But as chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, when the FBI wanted to build a new fingerprint division, he made sure that it wasn't built in Washington, right beside the FBI building, where there was lots of room. It had to be built in Charleston, West Virginia, which is over 2 hours away. But there was lots of space in Charleston, West Virginia, and he and his constituents were happy to have those jobs in West Virginia. You find that any travelers, particularly on interstate highways, for example, Route 81, could see some of Senator Byrd's work in West Virginia as well. When one is traveling on Route 81, say south on 81 from here in Pennsylvania, we find as you go through Pennsylvania, one goes through Maryland, one goes through Virginia, the road is 4-lane in all those states. However, when we go through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and into West Virginia for several miles, the road goes from 4 lanes to 6 lanes. That extra 2 lanes, an extra lane on each side, was compliments of Senator Robert Byrd, and how West Virginia got a little bit more funding so that they could swing that and have that happen. So one of the last things was Amtrak was going to cut back its service, its passenger service in West Virginia. And again, Senator Byrd called the top officials at Amtrak and said, if you folks would like to keep your federal funding where it is, you'll continue to serve West Virginia in the same manner that you have for years. And so Amtrak did not cut back its passenger service to West Virginia. Well, what are the roles that are available for individual legislators? Many of you have studied this in elementary school or secondary school. What might they be? Well, number one, state representatives and state senators can vote as delegates. When they vote as a delegate, that simply means that they're expressing the majority opinion of their voters. They know what the majority opinion is, or they believe they know what it is, and they vote that way, regardless of how they might feel. A second role that's available to a legislator is to be a trustee. A trustee is voting your conscience. You don't, you may know how the voters might feel on an issue in your district, but you are bound and determined that you are going to trust your best judgment, and you believe that you have information perhaps that they do not, and you vote as a delegate, as a trustee. So individual legislators can vote as delegates, where they just vote the way their constituents want, or they can vote as trustees, where they vote their conscience. Now, our state legislatures really are the offshoot, if you will, of colonial legislatures. Colonial legislatures were established all up and down the East Coast in the colonies primarily by the British. The colonies end up being British eventually. Of course, Florida was originally Spanish. But you find that these colonial legislatures really end up serving as the launching pads for our country's liberty. We find that the colonists simply borrowed from the government patterns that they were familiar with. In Great Britain, we had a parliament, and it had 2 chambers. It was bicameral. We have a lower chamber, the House of Commons, and we have an upper chamber, the House of Lords. So we find that here in the New World, the colonists simply brought the government structure with them that they were familiar with. We find that the king would appoint a governor for each and every colony, and the king would hope that the governor would be looking out for his interests, and then the colonists were elected. They elected their own legislators. So the legislature was really beholden to the people. The governors were beholden to the king. And this produced many deadlocks, many tense situations in terms of policymaking in the colonies. We find that as time went by, this continuing struggle between the king and the colonists was reflected in many of the colonial legislatures, and eventually they do serve as the launching pad for our country's liberty. We find that, of course, as the Revolutionary War ends, these colonial legislatures evolve into state legislatures. Interestingly enough, as we look through our nation's history, our state legislatures have had a remarkable predisposition to engage in irresponsible behavior. And this irresponsibility has taken many forms. One, for example, is that state legislatures have engaged widely for many, many decades in bribes and illegal payoffs. We find that former U.S. Senator Paul Simon, I believe President Obama had taken his seat when Senator Simon retired, representing the people of Illinois. You find, I believe, that it was Barack Obama that took that seat in the U.S. Senate. We find Paul Simon, you might remember, he had slicked back very shiny black hair. He was short. He always wore a bow tie, but he was a great shining example of integrity in government and honesty. So he wrote his autobiography when he retired from the U.S. Congress and from the state legislature. He wrote his biography, and he talks about his time in Springfield, Illinois, in the state legislature. And there he tells us that approximately 33% of all state legislators in Illinois accepted bribes, kickbacks, and other forms of payoffs. That is so surprising, very disheartening to hear. But Illinois has established itself as one of the best examples of statewide corruption in the country. So bribes and illegal payoffs. Fetcher bills are a second form of irresponsibility state legislatures have been responsible for. Fetcher bills are when a state representative or a state senator wants to have their cake and eat it too. They want to play both sides of an issue. Here is a situation where you say you have a state representative and they've held a position for many years. They've had perhaps a few interest groups that have opposed that position in their district, and perhaps year after year, decade after decade, they tire of dealing with them, and finally they decide, okay, we're going to get this interest group off my back. So I'll go ahead and I'll propose the legislation that they want. I will let them know, and therefore they will no longer bother me, and I'll get credit for them for trying to achieve their ends. But if this is a true Fetcher bill situation, what will happen is the state representative will do that, put in a bill, but they're nearly not behind it. And they will tell their legislative leadership that they really are not going to spend any political capital on it. The legislative leadership will thank them for letting them know, and they won't put any effort into it either. And then if it's a true Fetcher bill situation, the state representative will go and talk to the opponents of that legislation and assure them that he's really not behind it. He's doing this just to get these other interest groups off of his back. So that's a Fetcher bill. Thirdly, we find lobbyists play too large of a role in the life of the state legislature. Case in point was our own Commonwealth. We can go back as recently as 1949. In 1949, there were still 2 extra chairs on the dais of the Pennsylvania State Senate, one at the extreme left-hand side of the dais and one at the extreme right-hand side. Who occupied those chairs? Those chairs were occupied by the lobbyist for the Pennsylvania Railroad and the lobbyist for U.S. Steel. And what was true is that the lieutenant governor or the president pro tem, when they were dealing with legislation, before any legislation would advance at any stage of the legislative process, they would look to both sides, the right and the left, and so long as the lobbyists for U.S. Steel and the lobbyists for the Pennsylvania Railroad agreed with the bill and they got a nod yes, they would move the bill forward. If they got a nod no, they would kill the bill. You find that today lobbyists are no longer allowed in either the Senate or the House chamber in Harrisburg, but they're called lobbyists because they wait in the lobby for the senators and representatives to emerge from their chambers and walk back to their offices. They hope to catch them during that walk and try to give them their arguments for why they should vote for or against something that's coming up. You find lobbyists also play too large of a role by being omnipresent in the Capitol during any holiday season. They come bearing gifts to the various state senators and state representatives. Let's see. So far, their irresponsibility has taken the form of bribes and illegal payoffs, number 1. Fetcher bills, number 2. Number 3, lobbyists that play too large of a role. Number 4, state legislatures tend to react too quickly, too strongly, too inflexibly to emotional issues. Case in point, the state of Delaware spent a decade in the 1950s debating, discussing, studying whether or not they wanted to ban capital punishment. Finally, they voted to end and abolish capital punishment. Did they not think that there would ever be another homicide in the state of Delaware? 2 years later, a African-American man raped and knifed to death a white woman, and lo and behold, within 2 days, the Delaware State Senate had restored the death penalty in Delaware. Again, an example of a legislative body acting too quickly, too inflexibly to an issue that I imagine they had spent a good bit of time on and studying. Number 5, we also find that this irresponsibility can be found through simply sheer ineptitude. Sheer ineptitude can come from poor legislators, poor staff, maybe haste, or a combination of any of the three. We find that as we're looking for examples of legislative ineptitude. We can go to Indiana during the 1960s. A highway construction bill passed. This was a time before memory typewriters, before personal computers. This was a time when all we had was carbon paper. This was a time before Xerox machines. The legislature had adopted a final highway construction bill, and no one knew where the final copy was. They didn't remember how much money they were obligated to spend on the roads. So they simply put the matter aside for 2 years, and within 2 years, one of the librarians in the Indiana State Library found the budget bill and brought it to the legislature, and they could finally see what money they were obligated to spend on Indiana highways. Ohio at one point passed a law that said that the state symbol should be engraved on all state officials. Obviously what they meant to say was all state offices. but it came out state officials. In Kansas, you find another example of legislative ineptitude. In Kansas, the state legislature passed a law that said when two trains are approaching one another on a single track, they should both go to the nearest siding and wait for the other to pass. So when you're looking for problems of Amtrak, it may be that a lot of the rolling stock of Amtrak is indeed sidelined in Kansas. We should take a look. Alaska, a number of years ago, there was a state House member in the Alaska House of Representatives who believed that the legislature wasn't looking at their budget bill closely enough. And the leadership believed he just wanted his own amendment, so they said, please, put it in. Everyone wanted to go home. It was the end of session, and if you're familiar with Alaska, you know that Juneau is the only state capital that we can't what? It's the only state capital that we can't drive to. You have to fly in or you have to take a ferry in. So everyone had served along their expected time. They were ready to go home. But they let him put an amendment in, and he did. And they didn't look at it clearly. And sure enough, their faces became very red when they returned to their homes and found out the next day that they had eliminated their salaries. He put in a provision to eliminate state legislative salaries. So with great reluctance and a red face that all the members of the legislature came back next month to restore their salaries. Finally, another example of this was in Texas. There was another state House member who simply believed that his chamber wasn't paying enough attention to the budget when that was being constructed. And again, his leadership felt that he wasn't getting everything he wanted, and they said, simply put in what you want. And he said, well, I'd like a resolution. I'd like a resolution. So they said, we'll be happy to adopt your resolutions. And he put in a resolution to honor Albert DeSalvo for his fine and valiant attempts at population control. Well, the Texas legislature passed that. Who was Albert DeSalvo? None other than the Boston Strangler. Not a good piece of legislation. Well, why have we seen so many problems in this body that the United States Supreme Court once called, quote, the fountainhead of representative government in our country? The fountainhead of representative government in our country. Well, they've done it they've seen these problems for a number of reasons. One is the lack of visibility. When we look at the nation's national government, or we look at Congress, you find that there's lots of sources of information. We're drowning in information. Every night I can go home and I can turn on ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, PBS News, CNN, MSNBC. There's lots of news to be found. You find at the local level, you know how your government's doing because you live there. You're driving in streets that are either well paved or filled with potholes. Your children are coming home in the afternoon and you're being able to talk with them and see if they seem to be learning anything new. You have a sense of how well your local government's doing. When we look at state government, it's very difficult to determine how state government is doing. They're like a black hole. We throw all these resources into it and no light comes out the other end. Find that when I served in Harrisburg for several years, 1974, 75, and then 1985 to 1992, you find that we had approximately about 24 people in the state press room. Today, if you go to the state press room, about 12 of them might be professional media people. And one of those is, in fact, the UPI reporter, who is, in fact, a student intern. And that's been true for a few years. Well, the second reason why you have all these problems with state legislatures, according to many of my colleagues, is the fragmented nature of legislative bodies. All legislative bodies across the country, except for Nebraska, are bicameral. That means they have two by two chambers, a lower house and an upper house. And again, this is modeled on the Parliament of Great Britain. You find there is one state legislature in Nebraska that has one chamber. It's a unicameral legislature. By the way, when they had to choose to call themselves either representatives or senators, which one do you think they chose? You're right, senators. They called themselves senators. Well, my colleagues may believe that this produces fragmentation in state government, but we find that there are many of us who believe it's just a check and a balance, that the two chambers of the legislature may not outdo one another. Number three, it's hard to oversee lots of legislators. And how many legislators do we have in Pennsylvania? Well, we have 50 state senators and 203 state House members. Again, I ask you to remember that number, 253. It's hard to oversee 253 legislators, the House legislators, the Senate legislators, and all the committees. Well, we find that the fourth reason for these legislative problems experienced by the Senate is that the public hasn't held state legislative service in very high esteem for many years. How can we prove that? Well, we can prove that by just looking at, for example, the Florida state legislature. Florida's just recently overtaken Pennsylvania in population, and we see they're an up-and-coming state that has a very progressive agenda that's shared by the Republicans and the Democrats. But we find that in Florida, we find that the state capital's in Tallahassee. It's up in the extreme northwest corner of the state. It's not convenient for anyone except for those who live in the Panhandle. You find that state legislators, in fact, in Florida, are paid all of $29,000 a year. Now, think of the expenses involved with maintaining an apartment or some kind of an abode in Tallahassee, then also maintaining your house mortgage and paying for your children and your wife's upkeep at home. Kind of mind-boggling for $29,000, don't you think? So you find that that is certainly one reason why the public hasn't held state legislative service in high esteem. The salaries weren't good enough to attract good people. You find that this also manifests itself in one other way. The state capitals share a common characteristic. What's true? What does Richmond, Virginia have in common with Albany, New York, Columbus, Ohio, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, Dover, Delaware? What's true of all those places? Well, they all have other cities in the state that sort of outshine them in terms of culture and civilization. You find that every morning at the train station in Philadelphia, 30th Street, and every morning at the train station in New York City, you find Grand Central, there are a large group of people getting ready to get on the morning train to go to Harrisburg in the state, in the case of Pennsylvania, go to New York City in the case of Albany, and work for the day in state government. Do they live in the state capital? No, because they want better restaurants to be available, more cultural opportunities, and they think that the life is better in the state capital. So again, an aspect of state legislative service that's not attractive to the public. Well, number 5, another reason for legislative problems is simply frequent turnover of legislators, which brings inexperience to the job. Now, I again have to share my bias with you. I am a believer in term limits, so I like the legislators turning over, but on the other hand, I do not believe that we should have a professionalized state legislature. On one hand, you want people that have been there long enough to have an organizational memory and to be familiar with problems and the history of certain policy areas. On the other hand, you do not want someone who has no organizational memory and no idea of how to deal with the policy issues at hand. Well, the sixth reason for these legislative problems is that legislative service is frequently part-time, and it can conflict with your other job that you might hold. Let's take a look at Alabama. Alabama has a Senate Banking Committee. It's comprised of all bankers. I think that might be a bit of a conflict of interest. Excuse me. Maryland has something called the Beverage Control Committee, and the Beverage Control Committee is set up to control bars and taverns throughout Maryland. Who serves on that? Well, tavern owners and lawyers representing tavern owners. Couldn't be any misconceptions or misperceptions there either, could there be? Seventhly, the sheer volume of bills is another reason for this state of affairs with the chambers. The sheer volume of bills, there's many more bills introduced, many more bills today than ever before. On average, in the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, you have 6,000 bills a year being introduced. In the state Senate, you have 4,000 bills a year introduced, a session, excuse me. So that means that in any one session, Pennsylvania always has about a minimum of 10 to 12,000 bills. And it can be tricky. For example, if you ever do go to Harrisburg and work for a state senator or a state representative, you will frequently have them asking you what you believe to be true about a certain Senate bill or a House bill. Many times, it's not one of the prominent bills or one of the hot bills. And on one hand, you don't want to lie to them, but on the other hand, you should never admit to them you don't know something. So if you don't know the answer to a question about legislation, just tell them, excuse me, Senator, I'm on my way to a meeting, I'm late, I really need to go, may I call you back this afternoon on that? They're going to say yes. You back to your office, you look up the matter, you write it out, and then you call them and talk with them, give them the information they wanted. That's a very effective way of dealing with that. But so please remember that in Pennsylvania we have 10,000 bills every legislative session. These bills are more complicated than ever before. When I left Harrisburg in 1975 to go to grad school, I could read any bill for Senator Manbeck the year before, in 74, and I could understand it and analyze it. When I came back, returned to Pennsylvania in 1985 through 95, you find that there were many bills that I wouldn't have been able to analyze because of the complexity of the subject matter. Number 9, limited session time. We find that many state legislatures, unfortunately, have a session of only 1 month, where they try to do everything that they need to do in 1 month or 2 months' time. You find Pennsylvania is not one of those states. We are in session throughout the year, so we don't fall under this. But this is an introduction to state legislatures. Let's take a look at state legislative reform next. Let's take a break.